Hi, I'm Kieran Draveth. The first time I visited my wife's family estate in the hills of Ashmont Valley, I stopped to help an elderly man whose luxury car had broken down on the mountain road. Because of that, I was 2 hours late to their annual charity gala. And for being late, they called me gutter trash who doesn't belong in civilized society. Threw me out of their $45 million mansion like I was nothing. But here's what they didn't know. The man I helped owned the private equity firm that held the mortgage on their entire estate. And when he walked into their boardroom 3 days later wearing his usual $1,000 suit, he said 8 words that shattered their world forever. But what he revealed next didn't just destroy their pride, it exposed the financial house of cards they'd been living on for years. Want to know how I turned their family legacy into my personal victory? How I bought their mansion for half its value and changed every single lock while they watched from the street? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind cut through the streets of downtown Millbrook like a blade, sharp enough to make you pull your jacket tighter but not quite cold enough for winter gear. I kept both hands on the steering wheel of my 10-year-old Honda, trying to ignore the way Evelise kept checking her diamond watch every few minutes. We were supposed to be at her family's estate by 6, and it was already pushing 7:30. "This is important, Kieran," she said for the 4th time since we'd left our apartment in the city. Her voice had that edge it always carried when we were heading to Ashmont Valley, like she was preparing for battle. Mother specifically asked that we arrive early to help with the final preparations. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the winding mountain road ahead. The Kieran family's annual charity gala was legendary in their social circles. 500 of the most influential people in the state, all gathered in their $45 million estate to write checks for causes they'd forget about by Christmas. Evelise had grown up attending these events, but for me they were still foreign territory. "You remembered to pick up your suit from the cleaners, right?" she asked, though we both knew she'd reminded me 3 times yesterday. "It's hanging in the back seat," I replied. She twisted around to check, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. Everything about Evelise was precise, calculated, from her manicured nails to the way she spoke in measured sentences that never revealed too much emotion. It was one of the things that had first attracted me to her 3 years ago when we met at a conference for urban planning. She seemed so composed, so sure of herself in a world that often felt chaotic to me. Now, after 2 years of marriage, I sometimes wondered if that composure was really just distance. "You know how my parents feel about punctuality," she continued, folding her hands in her lap, "especially when it comes to family obligations." Family obligations, that's what she called these events, though I was never quite sure if I counted as family in her parents' eyes. Victoria Carowin had made it clear from our first meeting that she considered me a temporary phase in her daughter's life. A nice enough young man from a working-class background who would eventually be replaced by someone more suitable. Someone whose grandfather hadn't worked in a steel mill. Someone who knew which fork to use for the salad course without having to watch others first. The road curved upward through dense pine forests, past gates marked with names I recognized from the business section of the newspaper. This was old money country, where families measured their wealth not in millions but in generations. The Carowins had owned their estate for nearly a century, building their fortune through a combination of smart investments, strategic marriages, and what Victoria liked to call maintaining appropriate standards. Those standards didn't typically include city planners who grew up in row houses and paid their way through college with construction jobs. "Just remember," Evelise said as we passed the stone pillars marking the entrance to Ashmont Valley's exclusive residential area, "tonight isn't about us. It's about the foundation. Mothers worked for months to organize this event." I'd heard about those months of work. Victoria Carowin took her role as chairwoman of the Carowin Family Foundation seriously, treating it like a full-time career that happened to involve galas and fundraising instead of quarterly reports and board meetings. The foundation donated money to various causes throughout the state, though I'd noticed the recipients tended to be organizations that would look good in Society magazine photos rather than places that might actually need the help most. "She's expecting us to mingle," Evelise continued. "Make connections. You know how important networking is in your field." That was her way of saying I should be grateful for the opportunity to meet people who might advance my career, and she wasn't wrong. Half the city council would be there tonight, along with developers and architects whose projects shaped the entire region. But there was something about the way she phrased it that made it sound like charity. Like her family was doing me a favor by letting me breathe the same air as their guests. The Honda's engine strained slightly as we climbed higher into the mountains. These roads hadn't been designed for cars like mine. They were built for the kind of vehicles that came with drivers. Cars that cost more than most people's houses. I'd driven this route dozens of times over the past 2 years, but I still felt like an intruder every time I passed through the gates. My phone buzzed with a text message, probably work, calling about the Henderson project that was supposed to break ground next month. I was the lead planner on a mixed-use development that would bring affordable housing to an underserved part of the city. It was the kind of project I'd dreamed about working on when I first got into urban planning. Something that could actually make a difference in people's lives rather than just making developers richer. "Don't answer that," Evelise said without looking up from her own phone. "We're already late enough as it is." I let the phone buzz itself silent and focused on the road ahead. Through the trees, I could see the first glimpse of the Carowin estate. Its Georgian columns and perfectly manicured grounds spread across 50 acres of prime mountain real estate. Even from a distance, it looked like something out of a magazine. Which it had been, several times. Victoria kept framed copies of the Architectural Digest and Southern Living features in her sitting room, casually positioned where visitors couldn't miss them. "There's going to be a photographer from the Herald tonight," Evelise mentioned, still scrolling through messages. "Mother wants to make sure we get some good shots for the Foundation's newsletter." Good shots meant I'd need to smile and look like I belonged, pretend that standing in a room full of people who could buy and sell me 10 times over was as natural as breathing. It meant listening to conversations about vacation homes in the Hamptons and private school applications while nodding like I had any idea what they were talking about. It meant watching Evelise transform into the version of herself that her parents approved of, the one who laughed at jokes that weren't funny and complimented women on dresses that cost more than my monthly salary. The worst part was that I could see glimpses of the person I'd fallen in love with, buried underneath all those expectations and social requirements. Sometimes, late at night when we were alone in our apartment, she'd let her guard down, and I'd catch sight of the woman who used to stay up until 2 in the morning talking about architecture and city planning, who got excited about green spaces and sustainable development. But those moments were becoming rarer, especially when we were heading to family events. As we approached the final turn toward the estate's main entrance, I found myself thinking about the Henderson project again. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for next week, and I'd been working on my remarks for the past month. It would be my first time speaking publicly about a major development, my chance to show that urban planning could be about more than just zoning codes and parking requirements. It could be about building communities, creating spaces where people could thrive regardless of their income level or background. Of course, none of the people at tonight's gala would be interested in affordable housing. They were more concerned with making sure their own property values stayed high and their neighborhood stayed exclusive. But maybe, if I could find the right connections, I could start changing some minds. Maybe I could use their networks for something actually meaningful. The Honda's headlights swept across the stone gate posts, marking the entrance to the estate proper. In just a few minutes, we'd be pulling up to the circular drive, where valets would take our car and park it somewhere far from the Bentleys and Maseratis that belonged to the real guests. We'd walk up those marble steps into a world where I'd spend the next 4 hours trying to prove I belonged while knowing I never really would. But tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was the project, or maybe it was just accumulated exhaustion from playing this role for so long, but I found myself caring less about their approval than I had in months. Let them judge my clothes or my accent or the fact that I didn't know their private jokes about people and places I'd never heard of. I had work to do that actually mattered, and that was worth more than all their inherited wealth combined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At least, that's what I told myself as we turned through the gates and began the long drive toward the house. The mountain road twisted through shadows and golden light as the sun began its descent behind the pine-covered peaks. I was already calculating how long it would take to reach the estate when I saw him. An elderly man stood beside a sleek black Mercedes that sat at an odd angle on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking like a distress signal against the darkening forest. He was maybe 70, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that looked out of place on the side of a mountain road. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite whatever automotive crisis had stranded him, and even from our approaching car, I could see the frustration in his posture as he held a phone to his ear. "Don't even think about it," Evelise said before I'd fully processed what I was seeing. "Kieran, we are already 2 hours late. Mother is probably pacing the foyer right now, wondering where we are." I slowed the Honda, pulling closer to get a better look at the situation. The Mercedes was definitely disabled, sitting at an angle that suggested either a flat tire or something worse. The man noticed our approach and waved his phone in what looked like a gesture of helpless frustration. "He looks like he needs help," I said, already moving toward the shoulder. "He looks like he can afford roadside assistance," Evelise replied sharply. "And probably has it." "Kieran, I'm serious. We cannot be any later than we already are. Do you remember what happened last year when the Hendersons arrived late to the foundation dinner?" I remembered. Victoria had spent 20 minutes at breakfast the next day dissecting their tardiness, analyzing it like a military strategist reviewing a failed campaign. She'd questioned their commitment to the foundation, their respect for other people's time, and their general fitness for inclusion in the family's social circle. The Hendersons had been quietly dropped from several invitation lists after that. But looking at the stranded man, I thought about my own father, who'd once spent 3 hours on the side of Interstate 95 waiting for a tow truck that never came. A stranger had finally stopped to help, and Dad had talked about that kindness for years afterward. How it had restored his faith in people during one of the hardest periods of his life. "It'll take 5 minutes," I said, pulling the Honda onto the shoulder behind the Mercedes. Evelise's sigh could have powered a small wind turbine. "This is exactly the kind of thing that drives Mother crazy about you. You have no sense of priorities, no understanding of what's appropriate when." I put the car in park and turned to face her. "What's appropriate is helping someone who's stranded on a mountain road as it gets dark. What's appropriate is honoring your commitments to your wife's family," she shot back. "But you've never understood that, have you? You've never understood that sometimes the bigger picture matters more than your need to play hero to random strangers." Her words stung because there was enough truth in them to hurt. I did have a tendency to get involved in other people's problems, often at inconvenient times. But I'd never thought of it as playing hero. I thought of it as being human. "I'll make it quick," I said, getting out of the car before she could launch into a longer lecture about family obligations and social expectations. The mountain air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and approaching autumn. The elderly man looked up as I approached, his expression shifting from frustration to cautious hope. "Car trouble?" I asked. He nodded, gesturing toward the Mercedes with the kind of defeated gesture that transcended age and social class. "Transmission, I think. Just started making horrible noises and then died completely. My phone can't get a signal up here, and AAA is apparently backed up for hours even if I could reach them." I walked around the car, noting the way it sat lower in the front than it should. Definitely transmission trouble, probably expensive transmission trouble. The kind of repair that would take days even if they could get it towed tonight. "I'm Alvin Karaith," the man said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, his manner direct without being imperious. Despite the expensive suit and obviously costly car, there was something unpretentious about him that reminded me of my grandfather. "Kieran Draveth," I replied. "Where were you heading?" "Event up at the Carawan place," he said. "Foundation gala. I'm supposed to give a speech about community development initiatives." He laughed, but not with much humor. Ironic, considering I'm currently stranded and dependent on the kindness of strangers. The Carawan place. This man was heading to the same event we were, which meant he was likely someone important in Evelise's parents' social circle. Someone whose absence would be noticed, and whose stranded status would reflect poorly on the evening's organization. "I'm heading there too," I said. "Wife's family event. I can give you a ride." Alvin's face brightened considerably. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose, especially if you're already running late." Through the Honda's windshield, I could see Evelise checking her watch again, her expression growing more thunderous by the minute. We were definitely going to hear about this later, possibly for weeks, but looking at this stranded stranger, I thought about all the times someone had helped my family when we needed it. The neighbor who'd driven my mother to the hospital when Dad was working double shifts. The teacher who'd stayed after school to help me with college applications because nobody in my family had ever filled one out before. "No imposition," I said. "Let me just grab your important stuff from the car." Alvin retrieved a briefcase and what looked like speech notes from the Mercedes, along with a small overnight bag. As we walked back toward the Honda, he paused. "I have to ask," he said, "why are you stopping to help? Most people would have driven right by, especially when they're dressed for an event like this." I thought about that for a moment. My father always said you judge a person by what they do when nobody's keeping score, and right now nobody's keeping score. Alvin smiled, and for the first time since we'd stopped it reached his eyes. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," I said, opening the Honda's back door. "He died 5 years ago, but I try to remember the things he taught me." As Alvin settled into the back seat, I caught Evelisa's reflection in the rearview mirror. Her expression had shifted from anger to something more complicated, something that might have been embarrassment or possibly recognition. She'd met my father several times before he passed, and she genuinely liked him despite her mother's subtle disapproval of his working-class background. "Mrs. Draveth," Alvin said politely as I started the engine, "I'm very grateful to both of you for the rescue." I was starting to picture myself hiking down the mountain in dress shoes. "It's no problem," Evelise replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Kieran has a habit of stopping to help people." She didn't say it like it was entirely a compliment, but at least she wasn't openly criticizing me in front of a stranger. As we pulled back onto the mountain road, Alvin began talking about the evening's event, the Foundation's work, and his role in promoting community development throughout the region. His perspective was different from what I usually heard at these gatherings. Instead of talking about charity as something you did to feel good about yourself, he spoke about it as an investment in building stronger communities. He talked about affordable housing initiatives, job training programs, and educational opportunities in ways that reminded me why I'd gotten into urban planning in the first place. The key, he was saying as we approached the estate's gates, is understanding that real community development isn't about giving handouts. It's about creating systems that allow people to build better lives for themselves and their families. It's about removing barriers instead of just treating symptoms. I found myself nodding, thinking about the Henderson Project, and all the ways it could serve as a model for similar developments throughout the region. "That's exactly what we're trying to do with a project I'm working on downtown," I said. "Mixed-use development that includes affordable housing, but designed to integrate with existing neighborhoods instead of isolating people by income level." "The Henderson Project?" Alvin asked, leaning forward with sudden interest. "I've been following that development. Very impressive work. You're the lead planner on that?" The surprise in his voice was flattering, but I could feel Evelisa's attention sharpening in the passenger seat. She rarely showed much interest in my work projects, but having a stranger praise something I was doing seemed to change her perspective slightly. "I am," I said. "It's been challenging, trying to balance community needs with economic realities, but I think we found something that could work as a model for other cities." "I'd love to hear more about it," Alvin said as we pulled through the estate's gates. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation at the event." The circular drive was already crowded with luxury vehicles, their polished surfaces reflecting the warm light spilling from the mansion's windows. Valets in matching uniforms moved efficiently between cars, taking keys and providing claim tickets with practiced professionalism. Through the tall windows, I could see elegant figures moving through rooms that probably cost more to furnish than most people spent on their houses. As we pulled up to the valet station, Alvin gathered his belongings and turned to face both of us. "Thank you again," he said seriously. "This kind of kindness isn't as common as it should be, especially in circles like these." He paused, studying my face. "I have a feeling this conversation isn't over, Mr. Draveth. I'm very interested in learning more about your work." He handed his overnight bag to the valet and disappeared into the crowd of arriving guests, leaving Evelise and me alone in the Honda for a moment before our own valet appeared. "Well," she said finally, "that was unexpected." I wasn't sure if she meant stopping to help, Alvin's interest in my project, or the fact that our lateness might actually work in our favor for once. But as we stepped out of the car and began walking toward the mansion's imposing entrance, I found myself thinking that maybe tonight would be different after all. The Kieran estate rose before us like something out of a period film, all soaring columns and perfectly proportioned windows glowing with warm light. The circular drive buzzed with activity as valets efficiently managed the steady stream of arriving luxury vehicles. Bentleys, Maseratis, and Teslas formed an expensive parade, their polished surfaces reflecting the mansion's elegant facade. I handed our Honda's keys to a young valet who accepted them with professional courtesy, though I noticed the slight pause as he registered the difference between our decade-old car and the automotive aristocracy surrounding it. The claim ticket he handed me was the same as everyone else's, but somehow it felt different when you weren't sure your car would start reliably for the drive home. "Straighten your tie," Evelise murmured as we approached the entrance. "And remember, Mother specifically wanted us to arrive early to help with greeting guests." The irony wasn't lost on me. We were now nearly 3 hours late to an event where punctuality was supposedly crucial, but Evelise was still focused on the details that would matter to her mother, as if the right tie adjustment could somehow compensate for our tardiness. The mansion's front entrance was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, with marble steps leading up to doors that looked like they'd been imported from an English estate. Which they probably had been, knowing Victoria Carowin's attention to authentic period details. Uniformed staff members flanked the entrance, ready to assist guests or provide directions to various rooms within the sprawling house. As we climbed the steps, I caught sight of the guest list being checked at a discreet table beside the entrance. Names were being confirmed against what looked like a leather-bound registry, and I wondered briefly if our delay had caused any administrative confusion. But the hostess smiled warmly when she saw Evelise approaching. "Miss Carowin," she said, though it had been Mrs. Draveth for 2 years now, "your mother has been asking about you." "We had car trouble," Evelise replied smoothly, not exactly lying, but not mentioning that the car trouble hadn't been ours. "Is she in the main reception room?" "She's been moving between the library and the terrace, making sure everything runs smoothly," the hostess replied. "But I believe she's expecting you in the family receiving area first." The family receiving area? That was code for the private space, where Victoria would want to discuss our lateness away from the guests who were already arriving for cocktails and conversation. I'd been through enough of these events to recognize the patterns. Family members were expected to handle their obligations first, social interactions second. We passed through the mansion's grand foyer, where a crystal chandelier cast prismatic light across marble floors and oil paintings that probably belonged in museums. The space was designed to impress, and it succeeded completely. Even after multiple visits, I still felt slightly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of wealth displayed so casually throughout the house. Guests were already gathering in the main reception rooms, their voices creating a comfortable hum of conversation, punctuated by gentle laughter. I recognized several faces from previous events, though I couldn't always remember their names or exactly how they fit into the social ecosystem that revolved around families like the Carowins. They all seemed to know each other intimately, sharing references to shared experiences and mutual acquaintances that created an invisible web of connection. "Kieran! Evelise!" a familiar voice called from across the foyer. James Carowin, Evelise's younger brother, approached with the kind of confident stride that came from never doubting your welcome anywhere. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, his blonde hair styled in the effortlessly casual way that actually required significant effort and expensive products. "Mother's been looking for you," he said, embracing his sister with genuine warmth. She was starting to worry that something had happened. "We're fine," Evelise replied. "Just some unexpected delays on the road." James turned to me with a kind of smile that was friendly enough but never quite reached his eyes. "Kieran, good to see you. Ready for another evening of philanthropy and networking?" There was something in his tone that suggested he found the whole event slightly amusing, as if the serious business of charity work was really just an elaborate social game. Which, from his perspective, it probably was. James worked in his father's investment firm, but his real job seemed to be maintaining the family's social connections and ensuring their continued prominence in regional high society. "Looking forward to it," I replied, though that wasn't entirely true. "Should be an interesting evening." "Oh, it will be," James said with a grin that suggested he knew something we didn't. "Mother has some special guests tonight. People who could be very useful for the Foundation's expansion plans." Before I could ask what he meant by that, Victoria Carowin herself appeared at the entrance to the library, her presence immediately commanding attention even in a room full of people accustomed to being the center of attention themselves. She was dressed in an elegant navy dress that complemented her silver hair, and she moved with the kind of composed authority that came from decades of managing social events and family expectations. "Evelise," she said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to be polite and just enough coolness to convey disappointment. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd forgotten about tonight's event." "Of course not, Mother. Evelise replied, moving forward to accept her mother's brief embrace. We had some unexpected delays, but we're here now. Victoria's eyes shifted to me, and I could feel myself being evaluated according to criteria I'd never fully understand. My suit was appropriate, but not expensive enough. My posture was confident, but perhaps not deferential enough. My presence was acceptable, but somehow still not quite right for the family image she worked so carefully to maintain. "Kieran," she said with a nod that acknowledged my existence without exactly welcoming it. "I trust the drive-up wasn't too difficult?" "Not at all," I replied. "Beautiful evening for it." "Yes, well, punctuality has always been important for family events," she said, the words carefully chosen to sound like general wisdom rather than specific criticism, especially when there are obligations to other guests. This was classic Victoria Carowin, the ability to express disapproval through statements that were technically neutral but carried unmistakable meaning. She'd perfected the art of making people feel criticized without giving them anything specific to object to. "We stopped to help someone whose car had broken down," I said, partly because it was true and partly because I was tired of letting her implications go unchallenged. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly, as if the idea of stopping to help strangers was both foreign and faintly problematic. "How kind," she said in a tone that suggested kindness was a luxury they couldn't afford when family obligations were at stake. "Actually," Evelise interjected, "it turned out to be someone who was coming to the event anyway. Mr. Draveth. We gave him a ride when his Mercedes broke down." The change in Victoria's expression was immediate and dramatic. The polite disapproval disappeared, replaced by something that looked like genuine alarm. "Alvin Draveth?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp with attention. "You brought Alvin Draveth?" "Yes," I said, confused by her reaction. "He was stranded on the mountain road. His transmission died." Victoria exchanged a quick look with James, and I caught a flash of something that might have been panic in her carefully controlled expression. Alvin Draveth was clearly more important than just another guest, though I had no idea why his presence would cause such a strong reaction. "Where is he now?" Victoria asked. "He went in with the other arriving guests," Evelise said. "Why? Is there a problem?" "No problem," Victoria replied, but her voice suggested otherwise. "It's just that Mr. Draveth is a particularly important guest tonight. His attendance is crucial for some of the Foundation's initiatives." She paused, studying both of our faces with the kind of intensity usually reserved for crisis management. "I trust you made a good impression during the drive-up?" "We had a nice conversation," I said. "He seemed interested in some of the urban planning work I'm doing." Victoria's smile returned, but it was different now, more calculated. "Wonderful. Mr. Draveth's good opinion could be very valuable for your career, Kieran. I hope you'll take advantage of the opportunity to continue that conversation tonight." There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't just friendly advice, but I didn't have time to analyze it further. Other guests were beginning to fill the foyer, and Victoria's attention shifted to her duties as hostess. She moved away to greet new arrivals, leaving us standing near the library entrance. "Who exactly is Alvin Draveth?" I asked Evelise quietly. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted, "but if Mother's that concerned about impressing him, he must be someone important in the Foundation world." James overheard and leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let's just say Mr. Draveth's financial support could make or break some of Mother's more ambitious plans for expanding the Foundation's reach." That explained Victoria's reaction, but it also made me uncomfortable. I'd helped a stranded stranger because it was the right thing to do, not because I was trying to curry favor with someone who might be useful to my wife's family. The idea that my simple act of kindness was now being viewed as strategic networking left a sour taste in my mouth. "I should probably find him and continue our conversation," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was motivated by genuine interest in discussing urban planning or by pressure to maintain whatever positive impression I'd apparently made. "Good idea," James agreed. "Strike while the iron's hot, as they say." As we moved toward the main reception rooms, I found myself thinking about the conversation with Alvin during the drive-up. His interest in community development had seemed genuine. His questions about the Henderson project, thoughtful and informed. But now I wondered if there were other factors at play, connections and implications I wasn't sophisticated enough to recognize. The reception rooms were filling with guests, their conversations creating a sophisticated buzz of discussion about business, travel, and social obligations. I scanned the crowd for Alvin, wondering how the simple act of stopping to help a stranded motorist had suddenly become tangled up in family politics and foundation business. Sometimes I thought the most complicated part of being married to Evelise wasn't learning to navigate her world, but learning to recognize when my own natural instincts were being interpreted as something more calculating than they actually were. The main reception room buzzed with the kind of conversation that only happened when 200 people with more money than most small countries gathered in one place. Crystal glasses clinked against each other as guests sampled champagne that probably cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. The scent of expensive perfume and cologne mingled with the aroma of catered delicacies being passed on silver trays by uniformed staff members. I stood near the edge of the crowd, nursing a glass of sparkling water and trying to locate Alvin Karaith among the sea of elegant figures. Evelise had been pulled into a conversation with her college roommate and the roommate's hedge fund manager husband, leaving me to navigate the social dynamics on my own. Which was probably for the best, since my tendency to ask genuine questions about people's work often led to awkward silences when the honest answer was, "I don't actually do anything productive." "Kieran Draveth, isn't it?" A woman's voice interrupted my observation of the crowd. I turned to find Margaret Thornfield approaching, her silver hair perfectly styled and her navy dress complemented by jewelry that probably had its own insurance policy. Margaret was one of Victoria's closest friends and a regular fixture at these events, though I'd never been entirely sure what she actually did besides attend social gatherings and offer opinions about other people's life choices. "Mrs. Thornfield," I replied with what I hoped was an appropriate level of warmth. "Good to see you again." "I heard you had quite an adventure on the drive up," she said, her eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that suggested news of our roadside assistance had already made its way through the social network. Rescuing stranded motorists like some kind of good Samaritan. There was something in her tone that made the comparison sound less flattering than it should have, as if helping people was charming in a quaint, slightly naive way that sophisticated people might find amusing but wouldn't actually emulate themselves. "Just happened to be in the right place at the right time," I said. "Anyone would have done the same thing." Margaret's laugh was gentle but skeptical. "Oh, I'm not so sure about that. Most people would have been too concerned about their own schedules to stop for a stranger, especially when they were already late for a family obligation." The criticism was subtle but unmistakable. I'd prioritized a stranger's problem over my responsibilities to Evelise's family, which suggested either poor judgment or a failure to understand proper priorities. In Margaret's world, family obligations trumped almost everything else, and helping random people was something you did through organized charity work, not spontaneous roadside assistance. "It worked out well," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Mr. Karaith seemed grateful for the help." "Oh, I'm sure he was," Margaret replied, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced that gratitude from stranded strangers was worth much in the grand scheme of things. "Victoria mentioned that he was quite impressed with your conversation during the drive." Before I could respond, a young man in an expensive suit approached our small group. I recognized him as one of James's friends from prep school, though I couldn't remember his name or exactly what he did for a living. Something in finance, probably, since that seemed to be the default career path for most of the men in this social circle. "Kieran, right?" he said, extending his hand. "We met at the Christmas party last year." "Preston Whitmore." "Of course," I replied, though I had only the vaguest memory of our previous interaction. "Good to see you again." "I heard you're the one who rescued old Alvin Karaith from his automotive troubles," Preston said with a grin that suggested he found the whole situation amusing. "Very noble of you. Most people would have just called it natural selection and kept driving." Margaret laughed, and I found myself wondering if these people genuinely found cruelty amusing or if this was just their way of expressing sophistication through callousness. "Well," I said carefully, "I guess I'm not most people." "No, you certainly aren't," Preston agreed, and there was something in his tone that made it clear he didn't consider that entirely a compliment. Very refreshing, actually. It's not often we meet someone who still believes in random acts of kindness. The conversation was beginning to feel like a verbal minefield, where every response could be interpreted as either naive idealism or false modesty. I was rescued from having to navigate further when a server approached with a tray of appetizers, though I noticed that both Margaret and Preston declined the offerings, while I accepted a small piece of what looked like smoked salmon on some kind of artisanal cracker. I should probably find Evelise, I said, looking for an excuse to escape the increasingly uncomfortable exchange. Oh, she's holding court with the Museum Society board members, Margaret said, gesturing toward a corner of the room where I could indeed see my wife engaged in animated conversation with several elegantly dressed women. Very important networking for the Foundation's cultural initiatives. The implication was clear. Evelise was doing important work while I wandered around making small talk with people who probably didn't take me seriously anyway. It was another subtle reminder that I was essentially an accessory to these events, expected to be pleasant and unobtrusive while the real business happened among people who actually mattered. I think I'll get some air on the terrace, I said, moving away from Margaret and Preston before they could offer any more observations about my character or life choices. The terrace was less crowded than the main reception room, with maybe 20 guests scattered across the stone surface that overlooked the estate's carefully manicured gardens. The mountain air was crisp and clean, a relief after the increasingly stifling atmosphere inside, where every conversation seemed designed to establish and maintain social hierarchies. I found a relatively quiet spot near the stone balustrade and pulled out my phone to check messages. 3 texts from colleagues about the Henderson project, including one from the contractor asking about a change in the timeline for the affordable housing component. Real work, with real consequences for real people, which felt like a relief after the elaborate social theater happening inside the mansion. Escaping the crowd. I looked up to find Victoria Carwin approaching, a glass of white wine in her hand and an expression that suggested she had specific things she wanted to discuss. Away from the other guests, her hostess' smile was replaced by something more calculating, more direct. Just needed some air, I replied, sliding my phone back into my pocket. I wanted to thank you, she said, which surprised me. Victoria rarely expressed gratitude for anything I did, since most of my actions seemed to fall short of her expectations in one way or another. Your assistance to Mr. Draveth this evening could be very beneficial for the Foundation. I'm glad it worked out, I said, though I was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the way everyone seemed to be treating a simple act of kindness as if it were a calculated political move. Alvin Draveth controls significant resources, Victoria continued, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. His foundation provides funding for community development projects throughout the region, the kind of projects that might be very relevant to your career in urban planning. I began to understand where this conversation was heading. Victoria was never subtle when she detected an opportunity that might benefit the family's interests, and she clearly saw my connection with Alvin as something that could be developed for mutual advantage. He did seem interested in the Henderson project, I admitted. Exactly, Victoria said, her eyes lighting up with the kind of enthusiasm she usually reserved for successful fundraising strategies. That's the kind of connection that could open doors for you, Kieran. The kind of opportunity that doesn't come along very often for someone in your position. Someone in my position. The phrase carried all kinds of implications about social class, professional status, and family background. Victoria had never directly criticized my working-class origins, but she had a talent for making me feel like I should be grateful for any opportunities that came my way, regardless of whether I'd actually earned them. I appreciate the perspective, I said carefully. I'm going to arrange for you to sit at Mr. Draveth's table during dinner, Victoria continued, as if my preferences in the matter were irrelevant. That will give you an opportunity to continue the conversation you started during the drive-up. I trust you'll make the most of it. Before I could respond, she was already moving away, her attention shifting to other guests and other opportunities for strategic social management. I was left standing alone on the terrace, feeling like I'd somehow been assigned homework for an adult networking class I'd never signed up for. Through the tall windows, I could see the reception continuing inside, with guests moving in familiar patterns of conversation and connection. Evie was still engaged with the Museum Society women, her posture and expression suggesting she was thoroughly enjoying their discussion of whatever cultural initiatives they were planning. She looked completely at home in that environment, natural and confident in ways that I'd never quite managed, despite 2 years of practice. My phone buzzed with another message about the Henderson project, and I found myself thinking about the contrast between the work that actually mattered to me and the elaborate social performance that seemed to matter so much to everyone else. The affordable housing development would provide homes for dozens of families who couldn't otherwise afford to live in decent neighborhoods. It would include community spaces and green areas designed to bring people together across economic lines. It was the kind of project that could actually improve people's lives in measurable ways. But none of that seemed to matter as much as whether I could successfully network with Alvin Karaith over dinner, turning my roadside assistance into some kind of career advancement opportunity. The whole thing left me feeling slightly sick, as if my genuine desire to help people was being transformed into something calculating and manipulative. A server appeared on the terrace, announcing that dinner would be served in 10 minutes and guests should begin moving toward the formal dining room. I finished my sparkling water and headed back inside, wondering how I was going to navigate a dinner conversation that everyone else apparently saw as crucial for my professional future. The formal dining room was a masterpiece of understated elegance, with a table that could seat 40 people comfortably and still leave room for elaborate floral arrangements and multiple sets of silverware at each place setting. Name cards directed guests to their assigned seats, and I noticed that Victoria had indeed placed me at a table near the front of the room, close to where I assumed the evening's speakers would address the assembled crowd. As I found my assigned seat, I wondered if this was what advancement looked like in Evelise's world, not earning opportunities through hard work and competence, but positioning yourself correctly for strategic conversations with people who had the power to help or hinder your career. The formal dining room glowed with candlelight reflecting off crystal and silver, creating an atmosphere of elegant sophistication that made every conversation feel important. I found my assigned seat at a table positioned strategically near the front of the room, where I'd have an unobstructed view of the speakers and, more importantly, according to Victoria's obvious planning, close enough to Alvin Karaith's table to facilitate continued networking. The other guests at my table were a carefully selected mix of Foundation board members, local business leaders, and what appeared to be potential donors being cultivated for future generosity. I recognized the type from previous events, successful people who were being introduced to the Carowin family's particular version of organized philanthropy. Everyone was friendly enough, but their conversations had the slightly performative quality that suggested they were all aware this was as much about business as it was about charity. Kieran Draveth, isn't it? The woman to my left extended her hand with a practiced smile. Helena Garrison. I think we met briefly at the spring luncheon. I had no memory of meeting Helena Garrison, but I'd learned to nod politely and pretend recognition at these events. Half the people I was introduced to seemed to assume we'd met before, and correcting them only created awkward moments that served no useful purpose. Of course, I replied. Good to see you again. I heard you're working on that interesting affordable housing development downtown, she continued. The Henderson Project, right? Very ambitious undertaking. Her knowledge of my work surprised me. Most people at these events showed polite disinterest when urban planning came up in conversation, treating it like a necessary but boring aspect of municipal management. But Helena seemed genuinely informed about the project's goals and timeline. It's been challenging, I admitted. Trying to balance community needs with economic realities, but I think we've found an approach that could work as a model for other cities. I'm sure Alvin Karaith would be fascinated to hear more about it, Helena said, glancing toward the table where our rescued motorist was engaged in conversation with several other guests. His foundation has funded similar projects in other regions, though I believe this would be his first involvement in local development. The conversation continued through the first course, with Helena and the other guests asking informed questions about zoning challenges, financing structures, and community integration strategies. It was refreshing to discuss my work with people who actually understood the complexities involved, rather than nodding politely while clearly thinking about more interesting topics. But as the evening progressed, I began to notice something odd about the conversations happening around me. Several times I caught fragments of discussion between other tables that seemed to reference Alvin Karaith in ways that didn't quite match his role as a foundation executive. References to the Karaith decision and what happens if he changes his mind suggested there was more at stake tonight than just securing donations for community development projects. During the main course, I excused myself to visit the restroom, partly because I actually needed to, and partly because I wanted to move around the room and get a better sense of the evening's dynamics. The mansion's layout was familiar enough by now that I could navigate the hallways without getting lost, and the guest restroom was located in a quiet wing away from the main reception areas. As I walked back toward the dining room, I passed a partially open door that led to what I knew was Victoria's private study. Voices were coming from inside, and I recognized Victoria's tone even though I couldn't make out the specific words. What stopped me was hearing my own name mentioned in what sounded like a heated discussion. I paused in the hallway, not exactly eavesdropping but not walking away either. The ethical implications were complicated, but my curiosity was stronger than my conscience at that moment. The problem is that Kieran has no idea how important Karaith's decision is, Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the kind of stress that she usually managed to hide behind her public composure. He thinks tonight is just another charity event. Maybe that's for the best, came another voice that I recognized as belonging to Richard Carowin, Evelise's father. If he knew what was really at stake, he might not be as natural in his interactions with Karaith. Natural? Victoria's voice rose slightly. Richard. The man stopped to help a stranger on the side of the road. That kind of naive idealism could actually work in our favor, but only if we can control how the conversation develops. There was a pause, and then Richard spoke again. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we make sure Kieran understands how much his relationship with Karaith could benefit his career, Victoria replied, and how much it could benefit our family's interests as well. My stomach began to tighten as I realized they were discussing me like a piece on a chessboard, calculating how to use my accidental connection with Alvin Karaith for purposes I didn't fully understand. The casual way they talked about manipulating my natural behavior felt like a violation of something fundamental about trust and family relationships. The Foundation needs Karaith's support for the expansion project, Victoria continued. Without his backing, the whole initiative collapses. And if that happens, we lose credibility with the other major donors. The ripple effects could be devastating. So what you're saying, Richard's voice was carefully neutral, is that everything depends on whether Kieran can convince Karaith to approve our proposal. What I'm saying, Victoria replied with a kind of precision that suggested she'd thought this through carefully, is that Kieran's little rescue operation this evening might be the most important thing that's happened to this family in years, and we cannot afford to waste the opportunity. I backed away from the door, my mind racing as I tried to process what I'd just overheard. The evening wasn't about charity or community development or even networking for my career. It was about the Carowin family's need for Alvin Karaith's financial support for some kind of expansion project that was apparently crucial for their foundation's continued success. And somehow my simple act of helping a stranded motorist had turned me into a key player in their strategic planning, whether I wanted that role or not. I made my way back to the dining room, trying to appear casual while my thoughts churned with new questions about what was really happening tonight. The conversations around my table continued, but now I found myself listening more carefully to the references to Foundation business and future projects. Helena Garrison mentioned something about the timeline for the announcement and how important it was to, quote, have all the key stakeholders aligned. Alvin Karaith was still engaged in conversation at his nearby table, but I noticed that he seemed to be the center of attention in ways that went beyond normal social courtesy. People were listening to his comments with the kind of intensity usually reserved for someone whose opinions carried significant weight in important decisions. When the dessert course was served, I found myself thinking about the Henderson project and how it had become entangled in whatever power dynamics were playing out around Alvin Karaith's presence at this event. My urban planning work was genuinely important to me, and the idea that it might be used as leverage in some larger family business strategy left me feeling manipulated and slightly sick. "Everything all right?" Helena Garrison asked quietly. "You seem distracted." "Just thinking about work," I replied, which was partially true. "Well," she said with a knowing smile, "after tonight, you might find that your work opportunities expand considerably. Alvin Karaith has a reputation for supporting projects that align with his vision for community development." Her comment reminded me that everyone at this table probably knew more about the evening's real purpose than I did. They were all part of a social and business network that operated according to rules I was still learning, rules that apparently included using family members as unwitting tools for achieving strategic objectives. As the formal dinner concluded and guests began moving toward the reception rooms for coffee and continued conversation, I realized I needed to understand exactly what role I was being asked to play in whatever was happening between the Carowin family and Alvin Karaith. The problem was that asking direct questions would reveal that I had been eavesdropping, which would create its own set of complications. But one way or another, I was going to find out what was really at stake tonight, and whether my involvement was as innocent as it had initially appeared. The evening was far from over, and I had the unsettling feeling that the most important conversations were still ahead. The reception rooms buzzed with post-dinner conversation as guests moved freely between the library, terrace, and main salon, coffee cups and brandy snifters in hand. I found myself standing near the fireplace in the main salon, still processing what I'd overheard in Victoria's study, when the evening's dynamics shifted dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria's voice rang out across the room, commanding immediate attention from the scattered conversations. "If I could have your attention for just a moment." The crowd began to gather, forming a loose semicircle around the ornate marble fireplace where Victoria stood with the practiced poise of someone accustomed to addressing groups of influential people. Her smile was radiant, but I could detect the underlying tension that came from knowing how much was riding on the next few minutes. "As you know, tonight's gathering celebrates not just our foundation's current work, but our vision for expanding our impact throughout the region," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "That vision would not be possible without the support and partnership of remarkable individuals who share our commitment to meaningful community development." I noticed Alvin Karaith moving through the crowd, not toward the speaking area but around the perimeter of the gathered guests. There was something different about his demeanor now, a quiet confidence that suggested he was operating according to his own agenda, rather than simply participating in Victoria's orchestrated event. "I'm particularly pleased," Victoria continued, "to introduce someone whose foundation has been instrumental in supporting innovative community development projects across multiple states. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Alvin Karaith, whose partnership could enable us to expand our reach in ways we've only dreamed about." Polite applause filled the room as Alvin stepped forward, but instead of moving toward Victoria's position near the fireplace, he remained near the edge of the crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made everyone turn to face him rather than the designated speaking area. "Thank you, Mrs. Carowin," he said, his tone cordial but somehow commanding, "though I think there might be some misunderstanding about why I'm here tonight." A subtle tension rippled through the gathered guests. Victoria's smile remained fixed, but I could see confusion beginning to cloud her expression. This wasn't following the script she'd obviously planned. "You see," Alvin continued, his voice growing stronger, "I didn't come here tonight as a potential partner for the Carowin Foundation. I came here as the primary shareholder of Ashmont Valley Development Corporation, which holds the mortgage on this estate." The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, the subtle crackle of the fireplace, even the distant sound of staff cleaning up in the dining room. But no one in the reception room made a sound. "I've been reviewing the Foundation's financial records for the past 6 months," Alvin said, his tone remaining conversational despite the bombshell he was delivering. "Specifically, I've been investigating irregularities in how charitable donations have been used to support personal expenses and lifestyle maintenance, rather than actual community development." Victoria's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure with the skill of someone who'd spent decades managing social crises. "Mr. Karaith, surely this isn't the appropriate venue for discussing business matters." "On the contrary," Alvin replied, his eyes scanning the crowd of guests who were now listening with the kind of intense attention usually reserved for courtroom drama. "I think it's exactly the right venue. Especially since many of these people have contributed significant amounts to your foundation based on representations that appear to have been misleading." I found myself thinking about the conversations I'd overheard, the references to expansion projects and stakeholder alignment. The Carowin family hadn't just been hoping for Alvin's support, they'd been depending on it to cover up financial problems that were apparently much more serious than I'd realized. "But," Alvin continued, turning his attention directly toward me, "I have to say that my perspective on this entire situation changed significantly during my drive up here tonight." Every head in the room turned to follow his gaze. I felt suddenly exposed, standing there in my adequate but unremarkable suit while 200 of the region's most influential people focused their attention on me. "You see," Alvin said, his voice warming considerably, "I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Kieran Draveth this evening when my car broke down on the mountain road. And during our conversation, I learned about his work on the Henderson Project, which represents exactly the kind of genuine community development that foundations should be supporting." The power dynamics in the room shifted so quickly I could almost feel it physically. Guests who had been nodding, along with Victoria's introduction, were now looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and calculation, trying to reassess my importance in whatever was unfolding. "Mr. Draveth," Alvin said, addressing me directly, "would you mind telling these folks about your affordable housing initiative? I think they'd be very interested to hear about a project that actually serves working families rather than just providing tax benefits for wealthy donors." The request caught me completely off guard. I'd been prepared to be a background observer to whatever power struggle was happening between Alvin and the Carowin family. not to become a central player in the evening's drama. But as I looked around the room, seeing the expectant faces of people who had spent the entire evening treating me like a pleasant but irrelevant accessory to their important social gathering, I realized that something fundamental had changed. For the first time since arriving at the estate, I wasn't being asked to stay quiet and look appropriate while more important people conducted serious business. The Henderson Project, I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected, is designed to prove that affordable housing doesn't have to mean isolated poverty. We're creating mixed-income communities where working families can live alongside middle-class residents, with shared green spaces and community resources that benefit everyone. As I spoke, I could see Victoria's carefully controlled expression beginning to crack. The evening she'd planned as a showcase for the foundation's influence was rapidly becoming something entirely different, and she had no way to regain control of the narrative. The transformation was remarkable. In the span of 5 minutes, I'd gone from being the working-class son-in-law who needed to be managed and positioned appropriately, to being the person whose work represented everything the assembled donors thought they were supporting. And Alvin Kieran, the man whose approval the Kieran family desperately needed, was making it clear that my approach to community development was exactly what he wanted to fund. The applause that followed my impromptu presentation about the Henderson Project was genuine, the kind of enthusiastic response that came from people who finally understood they were hearing about actual community impact rather than abstract charitable concepts. But the sound died quickly as Alvin Kieran stepped forward again, his expression growing more serious. "Which brings me to why I'm really here tonight," he said, pulling a tablet from his jacket pocket. "Mrs. Kieran, I think your guests deserve to know exactly how their generous donations to your foundation have been used over the past 3 years." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "Mr. Kieran, this is highly inappropriate. These are private financial matters that should be discussed through proper channels." "Private?" Alvin's eyebrows rose. "Mrs. Kieran, when you solicit public donations for charitable purposes, your financial stewardship becomes a matter of public trust, and that trust has been violated in ways that would shock these good people." He swiped across the tablet screen, and I could see documents displayed there, though I was too far away to read the details. According to the records I've obtained through my audit, over 60% of the foundation's donations have been redirected to maintain this estate, fund family vacations, and cover personal expenses that have nothing to do with community development. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Helena Garrison, who had been so friendly during dinner, stepped closer to get a better look at whatever evidence Alvin was presenting. Other guests began pulling out their phones, and I realized they were probably checking their own donation records, trying to calculate how much of their charitable giving had been essentially stolen. "Furthermore," Alvin continued, his voice growing stronger as Victoria's face grew paler, "the few legitimate grants that were distributed went exclusively to organizations that provided personal benefits to the Kieran family. The Children's Museum renovation, for example, included a new wing named after Victoria's late father. The scholarship program funded exclusively students from Evelisa's private school." Richard Kieran finally stepped forward, his face flushed with what looked like a mixture of anger and panic. "This is an ambush," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his objections taken seriously. "You come into our home under false pretenses and then attack our family's reputation with accusations and insinuations." "False pretenses?" Alvin's laugh was cold. "Mr. Kieran, I told your wife exactly who I was when she invited me. I'm the majority shareholder in the company that holds your mortgage. I'm also the chairman of the Regional Foundation Oversight Board, which investigates charitable fraud. Your wife knew both of those facts when she spent months trying to secure my approval for your expansion project." The silence that followed was absolute. I could see guests looking at each other, realizing they'd been attending what they thought was a charity gala, but was actually a desperate attempt by the Kieran family to cover up years of financial mismanagement. "The expansion project," Alvin continued, "was never about increasing charitable impact. It was about accessing a larger pool of donations to maintain a lifestyle that your actual income couldn't support. And when my preliminary audit revealed the scope of the problem, you decided to use tonight's event as leverage, hoping that public pressure and family connections would convince me to overlook your violations." Victoria tried one last desperate gambit. "Even if there have been some administrative irregularities," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "surely we can resolve this privately. The foundation does important work, and destroying it would harm the communities we serve. Communities you serve? Alvin's voice rose for the first time all evening. Mrs. Carrowan, you've stolen money intended for affordable housing, food banks, and educational programs. You've used charitable donations to maintain a lifestyle that costs more per month than most of these supposed beneficiaries earn in a year. He turned to address the crowd directly. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that every donation you've made to this foundation over the past 3 years is tax-deductible for you, but it was never actually used for charitable purposes, which means you've been unknowingly participating in tax fraud. The effect was immediate and devastating. Guests began moving toward the exits, some stopping to demand contact information for Alvin's oversight board, others pulling out phones to call their accountants and lawyers. The elegant social gathering transformed into something that looked more like an evacuation. James Carrowan appeared at his mother's side, his face pale but his voice steady. "Mother, we need to call the lawyers, now." But it was too late for damage control. Helena Garrison approached me directly, her earlier friendliness replaced by sharp professional interest. "Mr. Draveth, I represent several foundations that are looking for legitimate community development projects to fund. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your Henderson project in detail." 3 other guests followed her lead, offering business cards and requesting meetings. The irony was overwhelming. After 2 years of being treated as the working-class outsider who needed to be tolerated for Evelisa's sake, I was suddenly the most popular person in the room. Meanwhile, Victoria stood near the fireplace looking like she'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, while Richard frantically whispered into his phone, probably calling their legal team to discuss damage control strategies that were already too late to implement. The evening that was supposed to secure their financial future had instead exposed their corruption to exactly the people whose continued support they needed most. And the man they'd been hoping to manipulate into partnership had turned out to be the one person with the power to destroy them completely. 3 months after that devastating evening, I stood in the circular driveway of the Carrowan estate, watching as a locksmith finished installing the last of the new security systems. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using the same valet area where I'd once handed over my Honda's keys while feeling like an intruder in someone else's world. The financial collapse of the Carrowan family had been swift and absolute. Within 2 weeks of Alvin's public exposure, the Regional Foundation Oversight Board had frozen all of the foundation's assets, pending a full criminal investigation. The IRS launched their own audit, and 3 major donors filed civil suits seeking recovery of their charitable contributions. Victoria's carefully constructed social empire crumbled as former friends distanced themselves from the scandal. But the final blow came when Alvin Draveth exercised his right as primary mortgage holder to call in the loan on the estate. $45 million in debt secured by property that was only worth $38 million in the current market, even before factoring in the legal fees and restitution payments they were facing. "Mr. Draveth," the locksmith called out, holding up a set of keys. "All finished. Every lock in the house has been changed, and the new security system is fully operational." I took the keys, feeling their weight in my palm. The same hands that had once folded napkins while enduring subtle insults now held the deed to the mansion, where I'd been treated like unwelcome charity. The property purchase had been surprisingly straightforward. Alvin's Development Corporation acquired the estate through foreclosure, then immediately offered it to me at cost as the foundation grant for the Henderson project expansion. The paperwork described it as a, quote, community development research facility, which was technically accurate since I planned to use it as a headquarters for affordable housing initiatives throughout the region. My phone buzzed with a text from Helena Garrison, who had become the lead coordinator for a coalition of foundations now funding my work. "Board meeting confirmed for next week. The Riverside Community Project proposal looks excellent." Riverside Community Project. The name made me smile, since it would provide affordable housing for working families in the same school district where Victoria had once implied I didn't belong. Sometimes justice had a sense of humor. As I walked up the marble steps toward the front entrance, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Evelise 6 weeks ago, when she'd finally called after weeks of silence following the gala disaster. "I'm sorry," she'd said, her voice small and unfamiliar over the phone. "I'm sorry I never stood up for you. I'm sorry I let them treat you like you weren't good enough. And I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to realize what I'd become." The apology was genuine, but it came too late. I'd spent 2 years trying to earn acceptance from people whose values I didn't share, whose approval meant compromising everything I actually cared about. The person I'd become in their world wasn't someone I recognized or respected. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I'd told her. But I can't be part of that search anymore. The divorce papers had been finalized last week. Evelise moved to her aunt's house in Connecticut, while Victoria and Richard relocated to a modest apartment downtown. Their social standing is ruined as their finances. James took a job with a brokerage firm in another state, starting over with a different last name to escape the family scandal. Inside the mansion, the rooms felt different now. Without the oppressive weight of other people's expectations, the spaces seemed larger, more welcoming. I'd already begun converting the formal dining room into a conference center for community planning meetings, and the library would become a resource center for families navigating affordable housing programs. The irony was perfect. The mansion that had once symbolized everything I supposedly wasn't good enough for would now serve families that the previous owners would have considered beneath their notice. My phone rang, and I recognized Alvin's number immediately. "How does it feel to be home?" he asked, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "It feels like justice," I replied, looking out through the tall windows at the mountains beyond. "But more than that, it feels like possibility." "Good," Alvin said, "because the board approved funding for 5 more Henderson-style developments across 3 states. Are you ready to change how this country thinks about affordable housing?" I walked out onto the terrace where I'd once stood feeling like an outsider, where Victoria had tried to manipulate me into networking for the family's benefit. Now it would host planning sessions for communities that actually needed what we were building. "I'm ready," I said. 6 months ago, they'd called me gutter trash, who didn't belong in civilized society. Tonight, I was sleeping in their $45 million mansion, preparing to use their former symbol of exclusivity as headquarters for the largest affordable housing initiative in the region's history. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's proving that the people who underestimated you were wrong about everything that actually matters. And sometimes, when you stop trying to earn approval from people whose values you don't share, you discover that your real worth was never up for debate in the first place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.